controlled the House majority at the time, refused to consider the bill. That legacy of failure largely explains why there's little enthusiasm among Democrats today for the extended bipartisan negotiations that characterized the 2006 and 2013 efforts. Immigrant advocacy groups aren't resisting efforts by Biden and Senate Democrats to seek possible areas of consensus with Republicans, but almost universally they consider them doomed to fail. At most, some advocates think it's possible that 10 Senate Republicans, the number needed to break a GOP filibuster, if every Democrat holds together, might support a pathway to citizenship, can't say that word, for the young undocumented people brought to the U.S. by their parents, or conceivably even longtime agriculture workers. But very few believe that 10 GOP senators will support legal status for any significant remainder of the undocumented, whatever concessions Democrats offer on other issues, like tougher border security. That's a key difference from the earlier negotiations, when Democrats operated on the assumption that if they provided sufficient reassurances on security, enough Republicans would embrace legalization. "We are working hard to get 10 Senate Republicans just to see if it's viable," said one leading immigration overhaul advocate, who asked to remain anonymous while discussing internal strategy. But the advocate added, given that Trump continues to drive the calculus about their next election, there's little expectation that 10 Republican votes are ultimately available. As a result, the principal energy among immigrant advocates is toward convincing congressional Democrats to legalize as many of the undocumented as they can through the reconciliation process, which requires only a majority vote in the Senate. Their focus isn't the reconciliation bill, now moving on Biden's COVID relief package, but rather another reconciliation bill that they expect him to unveil in a few weeks, encompassing his broader economic agenda. The advocates hope to include in that bill legalization for the young undocumented farm workers, immigrants who are in the U.S. on so-called temporary protected status, from countries experiencing natural disasters or political instability, and beyond that up to millions of additional undocumented people working in occupations that have been deemed essential during the pandemic. Together, those categories, which overlap somewhat, might cover as many as 7 million of the estimated 11 million undocumented workers. The feeling is it ends up in reconciliation. That's what we're driving toward, the advocate added. Legalizing the undocumented, who in many cases are longtime residents or have U.S. citizen children, has always been the top priority and moral center of the immigration debate for Democrats. But because the undocumented by definition are already living in the U.S., and the vast majority are already participating in the workforce, they would not address the population squeeze that's tightening on American society. The slowdown in population growth is one of the most significant changes in the political landscape since Congress last seriously tried to overhaul the immigration laws. In a recent paper, William Frey, a demographer at the Brookings Institution's Metropolitan Policy Program, noted that from 2019 to 2020, the nation's population grew more slowly than in any year since 1900. That was obviously influenced by the pandemic, but more troublingly, Frey reported that with deaths rising, births declining, and immigration contracting during the Trump years, the nation's population growth rate from 2010 through 2020 could be the lowest in any decade since the first census was conducted in 1790. The details of this slowdown are even more discouraging. While the working age population is stagnating, the senior population is exploding. Even under current levels of immigration, the Census Bureau projects that the senior population will grow by nearly 40% from now through 2035, almost exactly 10 times as fast as the working age population. Sooner or later, people are going to look at this chart and say, we're going to need more people in our labor force. We're going to need more customers, Frey told me. In a recent paper, Noorani and co-author Danilo Zak calculated that these trends will produce a precipitous decline in what's called the Dependency Ratio, the number of working-age adults, defined as those aged 18 to 64, available to support each senior. Today, there are about 3.5 working-age adults for each senior. By 2060, that number will plummet to 2.7, the lowest in modern times. Such a decline will increase pressure either for cuts in federal retirement programs, difficult tax increases on the working-age population to fund those programs, or some combination of both. Despite this looming demographic squeeze, Trump and congressional Republicans repeatedly tried to slash the levels of legal immigration. In 2018, 4/5 of House Republicans and nearly 3/4 of Senate Republicans voted to cut legal immigration by more than 40%. While that bill failed, Trump instituted a dizzying array of administrative actions to reduce legal immigration. And while those changes lowered the level of legal immigration only let's try that again. And while those changes lowered the level of legal immigration only relatively modestly from its high point in 2016, when it reached about 1.2 million, Anderson says Trump's policies would likely have imposed much more severe reductions through a second term, perhaps cutting immigration levels to around only 600,000 annually. Trump's persistent attempts to restrict legal immigration belied his frequent insistence that he wanted people to come to the U.S., but only if they followed the law. His effort reflected the cultural hostility to immigration of all sorts that now characterizes most of the GOP electorate. In a recent national survey by the nonpartisan Public Religion Research Institute, almost 3/5 of Republicans agreed with the openly xenophobic statement that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. Among Republicans who relied heavily on Fox News for information, agreement soared to 2/3. In another recent survey of Trump voters by the Conservative Ethics and Public Policy Center, almost 2/3 said they wanted to reduce the number of immigrants admitted to the U.S., and nearly as many said they wanted to deport all of the undocumented, while most Americans in polls consistently say they would provide the undocumented a path to citizenship. Those attitudes expose the great irony of the immigration debate. The nation's growing diversity is centered among the young. Bray says that the 2020 census will find that for the first time, a majority of the nation's under 18 population is non-white. But because the U.S. largely cut off immigration from 1924 to 1965, most older Americans are white. I've described this demographic contest as a collision between the brown and the gray, and one of its many implications is that through the 21st century, a growing and predominantly white senior population will depend on an increasingly non-white working-age population to pay the taxes that fund Social Security and Medicare. The older whites in Trump's coalition enthusiastically backing Republican politicians who promise to cut immigration are voting to endanger the entitlements on which they rely by slashing the number of working-age taxpayers available to support them. In a paper published earlier this month, Noorani and Zach argued for reorienting legal immigration policy around that dynamic. They argue the U.S. should set legal immigration levels with the goal of maintaining the dependency ratio at about its current level of 3.5 working-age adults for each retiree. As the senior population grows over the coming decades, that would require roughly a 37% increase in legal immigration, about 370,000 more people a year than the roughly 1 million to 1.2 million annually the U.S. has been admitting. We need to be talking about the future of immigration with the bottom line self-interest of Americans who want to retire in mind, Noorani says. Neither the White House nor congressional Democrats have yet produced an estimate of how many more people their plans would admit, and each seems reluctant to do so. But in the detailed analysis shared with CNN, Anderson calculates that if fully implemented, the Democratic proposal would essentially meet Noorani's target. Anderson projects that the bill would increase the flow of legal immigrants to about 1.5 million annually. At points over the coming decade, he says, the increase would be even greater because the bill also would clear out the huge backlogs that now have nearly 3.8 million eligible immigrants waiting for family reunification visas. Under the legislation, he calculates, America's working-age population would grow by nearly 1/4 more each year than it would under current policy. The bill does not fundamentally restructure the legal immigration system, which now admits migrants primarily through two principal streams, family reunification and employment. But it adjusts the rules in seemingly technical ways across multiple entry points in that system, systematically widening the spigot. For instance, the legislation seems to make only a minor change in the employment-based system, increasing the number of visas from the current 140,000 annually to 170,000. But in fact, Anderson notes, the bill could more than double the number of employment-based entrants, a top priority for business groups. The reason? While the spouses and minor children of employment-based immigrants are now counted against that 140,000 annual cap, they would be exempted from the new higher limit. That would allow all of the slots to be used for employment-based applicants and would have a further multiplying effect by creating eligibility for the immediate family members of that larger group. Other key changes include allowing all foreign students who earn PhDs in the U.S. to receive green cards, a pilot program allowing cities or counties facing population loss to sponsor immigrants who will relocate there, and slightly increasing the number of visas available to countries whose small immigration flows make them eligible for the diversity lottery, while again multiplying the impact by exempting spouses and minor children from the count. Another big change, providing visas to any eligible immigrant who has been waiting 10 years or more because of annual caps and country limits that restrict entry for certain family members, such as adult children or siblings of U.S. citizens. Typically, Democrats have supported clearing such backlogs before legalizing the undocumented to preempt the criticism that legalization penalizes immigrants who have been legally waiting in line. I'm having trouble talking today. Everything is like, bleh. My mouth is dry. That's part of the problem. Okay, while employment and family-based immigration have been pitted against each other in the previous legislative debates, Noorani says that's a false choice. Whichever door migrants come through, he notes, the vast majority will eventually join the workforce, which is exactly what the U.S. needs in the coming years. You can make a case that anybody who is working age is a net contributor to the system, he says. But can it get through Congress? The question is whether any of this has a path toward becoming law. One obstacle is the partisan conundrum noted above. Legal immigration revisions are likely to make the cut only if there's a comprehensive bill, rather than a package that's stripped down to try to squeeze it into reconciliation. But there will be a comprehensive package only if 10 Senate Republicans are willing to vote for one. And given Trump's continuing influence, that seems dubious, despite strong business community support for such a deal. Timing is a problem too. With millions of Americans still unemployed as a result of the pandemic, this isn't the ideal time to talk about the need to add more people to the workforce. Yet experts say America must shape these policies with an eye not on the next few months, but on the next few decades. It's hard to have this discussion now that we've had a terrible economic tragedy, a terrible public health tragedy, says Holtz-Eakin. But when you do immigration reform, it should be what you do. What do you? Oh, wow. Hard to read. Let me try that again. But when you do immigration reform, it should be what do you want? When you do immigration reform, it should be what do you want to the rules of the road. Oh, God. Okay, there's a problem with the way this is written. Let me read it the way it should be. Ah, but when you do immigration reform, it should be what do you want the rules of the road to be for the next 20 years, not what do you want to the rule. Blah, blah. You don't want to do this every year. Ah, that wasn't that important a line. It shouldn't have been so hard to say. Yet, even amid the pandemic, awareness of the population squeeze and its implications for the economy may be growing. Neil Bradley, Executive Vice President and Chief Policy Officer of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, says, "We are beginning to hear it in the states and almost on a local basis. While concerns about population loss have been greatest in rural areas," and as an editorial aside, if you drive through the smaller towns in this country, you'll see that they've been decimated. There's almost nothing open. There are people living there, but there are no businesses. There's nothing happening there. These towns are like mostly empty, and people drive long ways to go shopping because there's not enough population in these places to support stores and things like that. So we really need to repopulate a lot of these rural areas. Anyway, that's an editorial aside. Let me resume. While concerns about population loss have been greatest in rural areas, increasingly you hear people talking about it in Rust Belt cities. If we were going to do immigration reform, it's critical that we think through what provisions work best, for supporting the economy. And increasing legal immigration is one of the best things you can do to support future economic growth. The most optimistic scenario is that even if legal immigration loses out in this year's legislative maneuvering, success in legalizing some portion of the undocumented population through the special reconciliation process will generate momentum for more action later. Jorge Loeri, policy director at the American Immigration Council, an immigrant advocacy group, notes that every attempt to deal with any aspect of the immigration system has ultimately foundered on the emotional issue of addressing the undocumented. If that's removed from the equation, he says, there is the prospect. It opens the door to potentially a bipartisan consensus on moving something on legal immigration down the road with a new coalition. We can't quite get to that point because we are stuck on this threshold question of legalization for the undocumented. Immigration debate has rarely rewarded optimism in the past few decades, but there's mounting demographic evidence the U.S. will pay a heavy economic price in the next few decades if it can't break the immigration stalemate to alleviate its population squeeze. Without legal immigration, the United States is not going to see sustained population growth and will see declining economic growth as a consequence, says Cato's beer. It's just that simple. And it is just that simple. Immigrants, even if we were having births all over the place and increasing the number of working age people in this country, immigrants provide excitement, energy, real passion for doing things and making things happen. I mean, people come here because they want to improve. They want to improve their lives. They want to improve their situations, and so on. And they are people that will make things happen, that will get out there, find jobs, start businesses, revitalize communities. I mean, so even if it weren't a situation where we were losing population through attrition, let's say, it would still be the case that we would need to increase immigration and keep, or at least keep people coming here and joining our society and trying to make the best of the new place that they live. That's what it's basically all about. Okay. I have time for something quick here. Let's try this. It's entitled Immigration Policymaker on Biden's Reform Plan. This is a question and answer thing. So NPR's Michael Martin discusses immigration reform under the Biden administration with Teresa Cardinal Brown of the Bipartisan Policy Center and Chuck Rocca, a Democratic strategist. So Michael Martin says, we're going to turn now to the subject of immigration reform, which is a top priority for the Biden administration. President Biden has fulfilled his promise to send Congress an immigration reform bill. Details of the proposed legislation were unveiled last week by congressional Democrats, and it includes, among other things, a path to citizenship for the approximately 11 million immigrants who are in the U.S. without documentation. We wanted to talk about the plan in more detail, so we've invited Teresa Cardinal Brown to join us once again. She worked on immigration policy under President Barack Obama and President George W. Bush, and she's now the Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Welcome back, Teresa Cardinal Brown. Teresa Brown says, hi, nice to be here. Good beginning there. Martin asks, he states, we're also joined again by Chuck Rocca, who is a former senior advisor to the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, and he is one of the people credited with the Sanders campaign's success with Latino turnout. Welcome back to you as well, Chuck Rocca. Chuck says, hey, Michael, good to be here. I'm trying to read these. I'm kind of making this into a comedy. I don't mean to, but anyway. Martin, so, Teresa Cardinal Brown, I'm going to start with you because this Biden plan is ambitious. As we mentioned, it offers a path to citizenship for immigrants in the U.S. without documentation. It also expands legal immigration as well. This is something that we talked about in our prior conversation. You said that part of, the problem has been that there has not been kind of a truly, wow, that's hard to read. Let me try it again. You said that the problem has been that there has not been kind of a truly comprehensive approach to addressing the issues before us. Does this plan do that, in your view? Teresa Cardinal Brown. I'd say it makes a good attempt. I think, obviously, the big centerpiece is the broad-based legalization program. As you mentioned, it does expand the number of green cards available for both employment-based and family-based immigrants, but it doesn't make major changes to the immigration system. For example, the categories of who can come in or the criteria under which they could come. It has a little bit about border security. It does lean heavily on the idea of using technology and other surveillance systems to help secure the border, and it addresses needs at ports of entry. And it makes a big effort at addressing the root causes of migration from Central America. So I think there's a lot of good bones to this, but it's not necessarily fully comprehensive. But I think a lot of it has a pretty broad base of support too. Martin says, Chuck, what about you? I mean, you are the guy who counts votes. I mean, that's, you're a guy who, kind of generates support for ideas and sort of for people. What's your take on this? Rocca says, I think that it's very, very important, probably the single most important thing that's going to happen in conjunction with the 2022 midterm election. The majority is in the House and the Senate. Flow-through districts and states where Latino vote is the centerpiece of how Democrats will win. We've talked on this program and others for the lack of performance down ballot with Democrats with Latinos. They don't get this done if, again, they use our community as a piñata, knocking us from one side to the next. You can kiss away the Democratic majority in the House and the Senate. Martin asks, what do you think of the bill, Chuck? Rocca says, I think it's good. I've lived through a lot of this. I've lived through the 80s and the 90s and watched us go from Democrat to Republican. It's a good start, I would agree with Teresa, we needed some place to get in line. There's a young man named Luis who works for me he's actually a partner in my firm. He's been undocumented for 18 years, and he just got his permanent residency this week because he married his high school sweetheart. He's one of those DACA recipients that Teresa talked about. There never was a line for him to get into, and he's been here since he was 13 years old from Mexico. Now, there's a lot of those people around the country, and most Latino voters, over 67% of voters like me that are Latino who were born here, know somebody like Luis who was undocumented. That's why this is so powerful and needs to get done. Martin, let's talk a bit more about the sort of politics. As we said, a restrictionist approach to immigration was such a signature part of the prior administration that it should not be surprising that people who are closely associated with that administration's politics objected vehemently to the plan immediately. I'm thinking, say, like Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, who says that the plan rewards those who broke the law, end quote. But it sounds to me, Chuck, like maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, that you're more worried about keeping Democrats together. Democrats and more what? And sort of more moderate Democrats and Democrats in more sort of vulnerable areas. Is that right? Rocha says, that is right to a certain extent. So if you've got to break down the House and the Senate, in the Senate we need to win one more seat to keep the majority next year. Well, guess what? There are vulnerable Democrats in places like Arizona up in 2 years, Nevada up in 2 years. In Georgia, that we just won, Reverend Warnock needs to seek re-election. In Colorado, in places where the Latino vote will be important. Now, there will be consultants and political operatives that tells those vulnerable Democrats, now, we don't want to get too far out here on this immigration. There's a lot of white persuadable voters who won't like this very much, and I worry that those voices will win the day. But on the other side of that, in the House, there were 10 Republicans that won congressional seats that have more than 25% Latino population, like down in the Texas Valley, or down in Miami, or out in Orange County, California. Those Republicans now have a Latino population who they need to keep happy so they can in turn win re-election. Many of them are the same Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump. So there's good news and bad news on each side of the aisle. And Martin says, and Teresa, what about the politics of this? The conversation that we had previously as a person, you are the person who has worked on this issue across party lines for years. And one of the points that you've made is that there has been a consensus around this issue that the system needs to be brought into some sort of order, that it isn't, that it's completely chaotic. As Chuck has pointed out, there are people who have every intention of trying to regularize their status. There is no way for them to do it. Certainly, employers certainly are very interested in kinds of regularizing this as our family. So what would seem to be enough kind of buckets of support to put it together? So what about it? Is that bipartisan consensus just completely broken? Cardinal Brown says, on the policy, honestly, I think that there's still consensus. And I think that the important point that I would make, just sort of following what Chuck said, is that the moderates of both parties, the ones who are sitting in vulnerable positions in the next election, are going to be the ones who are the key to getting this done. You can't hold even if you hold every Democrat together in the Senate, you still need the vice president. And if you want to get any Republican votes, you're going to have to look at those moderate voters. And I think that's going to be key in both the House and the Senate. It's going to be those moderates that are probably going to drive the round of negotiation. What's it going to take to get them on board and stay on board? Well, I ran out of time. More to that story, but we'll maybe get to it next time, or we'll find something else. In any event, this has been CU Immigration here on WRFU and UPTV and YouTube, if you watch us there. We hope you will join us again at some point, and until then, have a great day.